What if I told you that the nationalist conservative Keiko Fujimori just won the presidential election in Peru after surviving imprisonment and years of political persecution by the far left? That every single election held in Latin America in 2025 has been won by a right-wing candidate without exception, and that the shutdown of USAID exposed the entire international left as a manufactured movement propped up by billions of American taxpayer dollars that evaporated the moment the money stopped flowing. Stick around, because what happened next will blow your mind. Something extraordinary is sweeping across an entire continent right now, and the legacy media does not want you to see it. Because what is happening in Latin America at this very moment is the single most powerful validation of the America First movement that has occurred anywhere on earth. Country after country after country is rejecting the radical left, throwing out Marxist governments, electing nationalist populist leaders, and following the exact same playbook that Donald Trump brought to American politics in 2015. And the speed at which this is happening is unlike anything the modern world has ever witnessed. This is not a gradual shift. This is not a slow trend playing out over decades. This is a tsunami. A political earthquake that is toppling leftist regimes across an entire hemisphere in a matter of months. And the aftershocks are being felt all the way from Buenos Aires to Brasilia to Washington, D.C. If you believe that the America First model of national sovereignty, border security, and rejection of globalist ideology is not just right for the United States, but is the future for every free nation in the Western Hemisphere, smash that like button right now. Every click helps us spread the word that the populist right is winning everywhere and the international left is collapsing under the weight of its own failure. Because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Keiko Fujimori won the Peruvian presidency and why her victory is the most significant election result in Latin America this year. What happened across the continent in 2025 that has the political left in a state of total panic? How the shutdown of USAID exposed the entire Latin American left as an artificial creation sustained by American taxpayer money. Why Brazil could be the next domino to fall as a Bolsonaro is leading in the polls. And what all of this means for the global populist movement and the 2026 midterms. Now let me start with Peru, because what just happened there is one of the most dramatic political stories anywhere in the world right now. Yesterday, Peruvians headed to the polls for a presidential runoff between Keiko Fujimori, the conservative standard-bearer who has been fighting the Peruvian left for over a decade, and Roberto Sanchez, a far-left congressman who described himself as the political heir to the jailed ex-president Pedro Castillo. It was a showdown between the populist right and the Marxist left, between national sovereignty and socialist ideology, between a woman who has survived imprisonment, political persecution, and every dirty trick the establishment could throw at her, and a man who wanted to drag Peru back into the same failed leftist experiment that has destroyed Venezuela and Cuba. The polls going in showed a dead heat, neck and neck. The media was preparing its narrative about how the left was resilient and how Latin America's rightward shift had hit its limit. The experts were hedging their predictions, and the establishment was hoping, praying that Sanchez would pull off the upset and prove that the pink tide was not dead after all. And then the votes came in, and Keiko Fujimori won. The Peruvian people looked at the choice between the nationalist right and the Marxist left, and they chose the right, decisively, clearly, after a campaign in which every institutional force in Peru was arrayed against her. Now let me tell you about the Fujimori name, because to understand why this victory matters so much, you need to understand the history behind it. In 1990, Peru was on its knees. The economy was in freefall. Hyperinflation had reached 7,000%. Marxist terror groups were bombing cities and massacring civilians. The country was collapsing. And into that chaos stepped Alberto Fujimori, Keiko's father, the son of Japanese immigrants, a complete political outsider, an agricultural engineer who had never held office a day in his life. Sound familiar? A political outsider with no government experience who stepped into a crisis and promised to fix what the establishment had broken. Alberto Fujimori was the Trump of Peru before Trump was the Trump of America. He came from outside the system. He was mocked by the establishment. He was dismissed by the experts. And he won overwhelmingly because the people were desperate for someone who would actually solve their problems instead of managing their decline. And he delivered. He stabilized the economy. He crushed the Marxist insurgency. He restored order to a country that was tearing itself apart. For millions of Peruvians, the name Fujimori is not just a political brand. It is salvation. It represents the man who saved their country from collapse when nobody else could. And the left has never forgiven the Fujimori family for that. They have spent decades trying to destroy the name. They jailed Alberto. They jailed Keiko. They put her in pretrial detention on trumped-up corruption charges and campaign finance allegations. They did everything they could to prevent her from picking up her father's political mantle. They used the exact same playbook that was used against Trump in the United States. Prosecute, persecute, imprison, silence. And just like with Trump, it did not work. The Peruvian people saw through it. They saw the political persecution for what it was. And yesterday, they answered the only way that matters, at the ballot box. With a vote for Keiko Fujimori that sends an unmistakable message to every leftist in Latin America. You cannot jail your way to power. You cannot prosecute your opponents into submission. The people will have their say. And their say is that they are done with the radical left. Now let me zoom out and show you the continental picture, because Peru is not an isolated event. It is the latest in a sequence of right-wing victories that is sweeping Latin America with a force that has no modern precedent. In 2025, the political right won every single election held in Latin America. Every single one. Not most, not a majority, everyone. Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Honduras, Costa Rica, and now Peru. Country after country, all moving in the same direction, all rejecting the left, all embracing the nationalist populist right. And consider the significance of some of these individual results. Bolivia. Bolivia wanted to be the next Venezuela. They were under the socialist regime of Evo Morales, aligned governments for 20 straight years. 2 decades of uninterrupted leftist rule, and they have officially flipped right. 20 years of socialism ended by the voters at the ballot box. Chile. Chile was the darling of the international left just a few years ago when they elected a young socialist president and tried to rewrite their constitution along Marxist lines. The constitutional rewrite failed. The socialist experiment collapsed, and now Chile has a right-wing government. Honduras, a country that the left had targeted as a model for Central American socialism, flipped right. Ecuador. Daniel Noboa, a right-wing businessman, won the presidency on a platform of crushing the cartels that had turned Ecuador into one of the most dangerous nations in the hemisphere. The voters looked at El Salvador's transformation under Nayib Bukele and said, if they can do it, we can do it. And they elected a leader who promised the same approach. And that is the key to understanding the entire Latin American shift. Nayib Bukele in El Salvador is the proof of concept for everything that is happening across the continent. Before Bukele, El Salvador had the highest murder rate per capita in the entire Western Hemisphere. The gangs controlled entire neighborhoods, entire cities. Citizens lived in fear every day of their lives. The government was powerless or complicit or both. And the international community told Salvadorans that this was simply how things were. That gang violence was a structural problem that could be managed but never solved. That the best they could hope for was a gradual reduction over decades of patient social programming. Bukele rejected that narrative entirely. He launched the most aggressive anti-gang campaign in the history of the Western Hemisphere. He arrested tens of thousands of gang members. He built a massive new prison to house them. He deployed the military to take back neighborhoods that had been controlled by gangs for generations. And the international human rights establishment screamed. They called him an authoritarian, a dictator, a threat to democracy. They condemned his methods. They filed reports. They held press conferences. And El Salvador went from the highest murder rate in the hemisphere to the lowest. Not in a generation, in a few years. The streets that had been war zones became safe. Businesses reopened. Tourism returned. Families could walk outside without fear for the first time in decades. And Bukele's approval rating hit 85%, the highest of any leader in the hemisphere. Every country in Latin America watched what happened in El Salvador. Every voter in every nation on the continent saw the before and after. They saw a country that was told its problems were unsolvable transform itself completely by simply changing its leadership. And they asked the most dangerous question any voter can ask. If it worked there, why can we not do it here? That question is what is driving the continental shift. It is what powered Keiko Fujimori to victory in Peru. It is what flipped Bolivia after 20 years of socialism. It is what is changing Chile and Honduras and Ecuador. And it is what is threatening to bring down the leftist government in Brazil. Now, let me tell you about what really caused this shift, because the policy failures of the left are only part of the story. The other part is something that happened right here in the United States, something that you made possible. When President Trump took office and DOGE effectively dismantled USAID in early 2025, canceling 90% of its contracts and folding its remnants into the State Department, something remarkable happened across Latin America. Leftist civil society organizations from Colombia to Peru to Venezuela began shutting down. Programs that had seemed permanent evaporated overnight. Political advocacy networks that appeared deeply rooted in local communities suddenly had no roots at all, because those organizations were not organic. They were not grassroots. They were not the authentic expression of the will of Latin American people. They were manufactured, built and sustained by an artificial life support system of American taxpayer dollars funneled through USAID. The White House documented what this money was actually funding. Millions in ideologically driven programs with near zero accountability. LGBT activism in Guatemala. Tourism projects in Egypt. Radical leftist advocacy organizations receiving year after year of U.S. taxpayer funds with no questions asked and no results demanded. USAID was not an aid program. It was a slush fund for the international left. It was the mechanism by which the American taxpayer was forced to subsidize the installation and maintenance of leftist governments across the developing world. And Latin America was ground zero for that operation. Strip away the funding and you find out what people actually believe. And in Latin America, what they actually believe turns out to be overwhelmingly conservative. The moment the American money stopped flowing, the leftist organizations started collapsing. The leftist candidates started losing. The leftist governments started falling. Because they were never as popular as they appeared. Their popularity was purchased, and when the purchase price was no longer being paid, the product disappeared. That is the most important lesson of the Latin American realignment. The international left is not a movement. It is a product that requires constant external funding to sustain. Remove the funding and the product ceases to exist. And that is exactly what happened when Trump shut down USAID. Now let me tell you about Brazil, because Brazil could be the next and biggest domino to fall. Flavio Bolsonaro, the eldest son of former President Jair Bolsonaro, is running for president, and the polls are showing something that the Brazilian left desperately does not want to see. He is not just competitive, he is winning. A Datafolha poll from April showed Flavio numerically ahead of the current president, the ultra-Marxist Lula, 46 to 45. That is the first time a challenger from the right has led in that polling series. Now, Flavio faces significant headwinds. The establishment left has unleashed a massive smear campaign against him. They are accusing him of fraud. They are trying to disqualify him. They are using every tool of institutional power to prevent another Bolsonaro from reaching the presidency. The same playbook they used against Keiko Fujimori. The same playbook they used against Donald Trump. Prosecute, persecute, prevent. And the right in Brazil is somewhat fragmented. Multiple right-wing figures and parties are competing for the conservative vote, which allows the left to maintain a plurality even when the majority of the country leans right. Divide and conquer has been the left's most effective strategy in Brazil. But the Bolsonaro name carries enormous weight. Jair Bolsonaro won a landslide victory in 2018. His presidency was marked by the same populist energy and the same establishment resistance that defined Trump's first term. And if the Latin American right-wing wave continues, if the momentum from Peru and Bolivia and Chile and Ecuador keeps building, Brazil will feel it. The 2023 election cycle showed that right-leaning candidates have won approximately 23 of the region's elections since that year. The so-called pink tide that flooded Latin America with socialism during the Biden years is not just receding, it is evaporating. And the right is filling every inch of the space it leaves behind. This is what the world looks like when the America First model goes global. When nation after nation looks at the choice between nationalist populism and Marxist globalism and chooses sovereignty. When country after country watches El Salvador and Argentina and says, we want that. When an entire hemisphere decides simultaneously that the failed ideology of the left is not something they have to live with. The left had its chance. It had decades of chances. It had billions of dollars in American taxpayer funding through USAID. It had the backing of the international establishment. It had the support of the United Nations and the European Union and every globalist institution on earth. And it produced Venezuela. It produced the Castillo presidency in Peru. It produced 20 years of Morales in Bolivia. It produced record crime and record inflation and record migration and record suffering across the entire continent. And now the people have spoken. Not in one country, not in a few countries, across the entire continent. In every election, without exception, they have chosen the right. They have chosen sovereignty. They have chosen security. They have chosen prosperity over ideology and results over rhetoric. The Make America Great Again model has become the Make Your Country Great Again model. And it is winning everywhere it is tried. Everywhere, without exception. The international left told you this could never happen. They told you populism was a disease that would burn itself out. They told you the global order they built was permanent and unshakable. They told you that the people of Latin America would never abandon the socialist dream. They were wrong about everything, as usual. And the results from Peru are just the latest in an unbroken chain of proof that the populist right is the future. Not just for America, for the entire Western Hemisphere and beyond. Don't stop here. The Latin American political revolution is accelerating, and new elections are coming up across the continent that could flip even more countries to the right. Click on the next video and join us as we continue to cover the global rise of the populist right and the complete collapse of the international left from Washington to Lima to Brasilia and everywhere in between.